Hello and welcome again to our reflections on upcoming weekend scriptures, this being the 12th Sunday weekend of the year. And the readings, the first reading comes from the book of Job, from chapter 38, verses 1, and then verses 8 through 11. Second reading continues sections from St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, from chapter 5, verses 14 through 17. And the gospel, of course, is Mark, chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. This finishes up the fourth chapter of Mark. And so to begin, let me just point out that as chapter 4 continued, to back up a moment, you remember in verse 34, the mention was made that Jesus spoke only in parables. Remember, that's what we had looked at, 2 of the 4 parables that make up chapter 4. But to his disciples, he explained all things in private. Now, that may be interesting because one of the characteristics of the of the first gospel of Mark's story, you remember, I may have mentioned this before, maybe earlier on when we started, but one of the characteristics of this gospel is that in revealing who Jesus is as the Son of God, as the messenger of God, as the great Redeemer, many people who are not close to Jesus seem to get what Jesus is saying and who he is. And the ones who do not seem to understand who Jesus is turns out to be those closest to him. And of course, that would be the disciples. And so why Mark points out that Jesus has to explain to the disciples in private what he is saying and what he is doing, it's not particularly complimentary, or even saying that he doesn't want the others to know what he is saying, but is saying that they are quicker to pick up the message of Jesus than his disciples. In that sense, and this is true now only of the gospel tradition of Mark, that he presents the disciples as generally very slow to pick up what Jesus is saying. We will see how this occurs in other places throughout the gospel. Now, the first reading this time from the famous book of Job is chosen really for 2 verses that appear in this longer work. But it may be an opportunity for us to review just a little bit the importance of this book of Job, one of the most beautifully written of books in the Old Testament, particularly in the Hebrew language, but also one of the most provocative of thinking and of works. It is a work, a rather long work, that is made up of 5 sections. And the opening part, which we might call a prologue, and the closing part, which we might call an epilogue, serve as kind of bookends or parentheses for the whole message of this book. Now, how is it divided up? It's divided, as I mentioned, in chapter 1 by a beginning, and then continue to chapter 2. Actually, it's chapters 1 and 2, and then has a conclusion at the very end of the work, which is written in prose. And it represents an older story that is used by the author to deal with the essential message. Now, the essential message of this book is found beginning in chapter 3 and going all the way to chapter 42. So, as I say, the bulk of the material is what we would call poetic rather than prosaic. What's the prose story? And the prose story is this, or the whole gist of the story is, why is it that innocent people suffer. The theory apparently at work in many minds in the Old Testament world, and sometimes this is transferred into the New Testament thinking, is things go wrong because people deserve it. That somehow punishment is what is merited out for wrong deeds or bad things. Now, take the theory the other way around. What if it's true that you have someone who is totally innocent and yet one who suffers? How is it possible for the righteous to experience such evil? Another question, where is divine justice? If good people suffer, isn't that against what we believe God should be doing, namely rewarding good and punishing evil, which was a theory that was prevalent in much of the thinking of the Old Testament, and I dare say still remains a way of thinking in much of perhaps our own Christian thought, that somehow when things go wrong, when hurt comes, well, maybe in a certain way we are guilty and deserve it. And so that's a real kind of problem. Another question that certainly might be raised and is somewhat addressed in this book of Job is personal goodness predicated on a life of blessing. The ancients thought that if things go well for a person, it's God's way of saying you're a good person. If things go badly, it's God's way of saying, well, you're not so good as what you are doing. So that's the kind of premise of this book. It starts with, as I mentioned, a very popular story, that there was a man named Job who really seemed to have been blessed by God. He had lots of worldly goods, flocks, herds. He had a beautiful house. He had a great family. He had good health. You couldn't ask for a more blessed life, kind of the life that I know many of you live, and well, that most of us do not. And it pictures by God being upstairs, and it's a kind of original of the upstairs, downstairs way of doing things. Could almost be developed as a play, and in fact the book of Job has in our time been turned into a play. But upstairs God is dining with the denizens of heaven, whoever they are, and in comes a character known as a Satan. Now Satan here is not the devil. Satan here is in the employ of the divine. And Satan says to God, I've kind of checked the earth and everything is going well and everything is working according to the harmony that you have established. And God then says to Satan, and by the way, in your travels, did you notice my servant Job? How good and loyal and faithful he is. Now, Satan, whose job it is to kind of test things, says to the Almighty, well, wouldn't you kind of remain loyal if everything were going your way, if you had everything in life that you could want? And God now says to Satan, all right, here's a little contest. I'll bet you, I don't know how God bets with Satan, but anyway, I'll bet you that no matter what you do, Job will remain loyal. Satan, and you can do anything you want to Job except affect his health. All right? So as the story unfolds, there is Job down on earth now, so God is upstairs, kind of watching if you want, and downstairs Job is eating with his family, having a wonderful dinner, and in comes one of his servants who says, Job, by the way, all your cattle have been destroyed by a disease. Another comes in and says all your oxen have been stolen by another group. Another comes in and says all the livestock that you ever had has been destroyed. another comes in and says, you know, your sons and daughters were having dinner in a house and the roof fell in and they're all dead. And Job says, well, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So here is Job, who accepts everything from God and accepts everything that goes wrong. Well, upstairs, God meets now with Satan and smiles and says, you see, I told you, Job is loyal regardless of anything. Yes, says Satan, but you haven't touched him. You've touched things around him. God says, all right, do whatever you want to him, but you can't kill him. And so now we meet Job once again down here on earth. This time, he is sitting outside in the noonday sun on a hill of dung. You all kind of remember what that is. And he is covered with sores and all kinds of outside suffering. And along comes his wife who says, Job, what did you do to deserve this? You must have done something wrong. And Job says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And we go back up to heaven, and you can imagine the little contest now between God and Satan. However, that would be the framework. That's the prose section. Now we come to chapter 3, where we again meet Job sitting there in the noonday sun, saying, you know, you remember the day when they came in and said it's a boy and how happy they were? I wish it had never happened. In fact, I wish I had never been born. And now you're going to get a struggle in which Job is not this patient and accepts everything, but is concerned because, in effect, he says, I haven't done anything wrong, and here I am undergoing all this suffering. It isn't right, and it isn't fair. Well, along comes, and this is the gist of the book, as you remember, along comes 3 of his friends, and they are there to kind of say to Job, look, Job, if you admit what you did wrong, then you'll feel good, and we'll feel better. Because the theory, as I mentioned, is good is rewarded, bad is punished. Job has done something to deserve what he's going through. As these 3 friends, each of them will give a speech to Job 3 times. So all told, there will be 9 speeches given. And after each of the speeches, Job gives a response. And each time he says, in effect, now you can read this, it's a rather long work. As I mentioned, the bulk of this material goes from chapter 3 to chapter 38. So it's a number of speeches that are given by his friends, all aimed at the same thing. Job, own up, admit what you've done. And Job continually says, I didn't do anything. And as the speeches increases, Job's response gets even more vocal. In fact, after the 3rd time that the 3rd friend has kind of given his speech, Job says, look, I didn't do anything wrong, and you, God, ought to come down here and clarify things. He really, this very patient Job that you may have grown up with, is not so patient at this point. And that's where we're going to, and then just before that happens, the 3 friends kind of step to the side. Along comes this young guy who just kind of got out of religion class and who thinks he knows everything, comes up to Job and says, now look at Job. They haven't been able to help you, but I'll help you. Let me tell you how wonderful God is and all of that. Look, what did you do wrong? Kind of own up. And he hasn't been listening either. Well, as chapter 38 begins, it's what we call a theophany, in which, and it begins by, out of the cloud comes the voice of God, who says, Who is this that is speaking thus? In chapter 38 through chapter 42, verses 6, contains two what we call theophanies, or speeches of God, in which it isn't that God is angry with Job for questioning, but rather will kind of suggest to Job that maybe he ought to look at things from a different point of view. In fact, Job's question to God is never really answered, but something else takes place. Now, all of this is background for a couple of lines that appear in the reading that we hear this week, where God says, "Oh, that I had one to hear me. Out of the storm comes the voice of God, who says to Job, when I created the world, when I took the waters and put them into place, were you there?" The point that will be made is that Job can only stand and hear what God has done. All right, now all of that, why is that chosen? Because let's look at the gospel to see why that passage is. Remember I said that the first reading is often chosen in some way to reflect something that goes on in the gospel. In the gospel, picks up where Jesus had been finished teaching him of the parables, and he now says to his disciples, "Let's go to the other shore." Now, what body of water are we talking about here? Well, the famous Lake of Gennesareth, or the Sea of Galilee. And in this gospel, I may have mentioned this before, but in this gospel, he pictures Jesus and his disciples as moving from one shore, which is where the Israelites or Hebrews lived, to the opposite shore, which is Gentile, or the others. And then he will picture them as returning. And twice this happens, kind of back and forth. This is the first time that this happens. Jesus, for whatever reason, stays behind. Now, the disciples get into a boat, and Jesus, in this case, gets in with them. And they begin to cross the Sea of Galilee, which we do believe is subject to what we would call sudden storms. They come up. Usually fishermen were used to this and could kind of handle it, but once in a while there were such violent storms, so quick, that they did cause the kind of people in the boat to be disturbed. You remember, we have mentioned this before, the boat that was used, we have discovered, I've spoken about this on another occasion, was discovered in 1986, the remains of a boat from the first century world, which when we put it together, figure out that the size of boat that we're talking about here would be about 26 feet long and about 8 feet in width. It could approximately hold as up to 12 to 15 people. So they weren't huge boats, but they were, enough. And in this boat, as the story unfolds, Jesus goes to sleep at the helm of the boat, or the front of the boat, on a cushion. Now, a sudden storm arises, and it becomes so violent that the disciples wake Jesus. Now, could you be sleeping through a storm like this? It's a very interesting observation. It does also require a little bit of familiarity with Old Testament works. Perhaps you are familiar with the story of Jonah and the big fish, and that when Jonah had been fleeing from the mission that God had given him, and a storm had arisen in the ship that they were sailing in. Jonah had been asleep down in the hull inside of the boat, and the sailors finally had woken up Jonah and said, "How do you sleep through all of this?" And the upshot of that story, remember, is that Jonah had been thrown overboard and swallowed up by the huge fish. So there was a little bit of humor there. How could Jesus really be sleeping against a storm so violent that the waters kind of are coming in over the sides? And there he is. The disciples, one can only imagine, were kind of trying to get the water out and saying to Jesus, "Help us." And Jesus gets up, says, "Oh, why do you have such little faith?" Speaks, and the storm subsides, and the waters go back, and the wind stops. So it's a marvelous story that Mark includes here now to help his disciples understand something about what Jesus is all about and who he is. So it's all's well that ends well kind of story. Water, of course, is in the Bible often pictured as dangerous and mysterious, although one would have to say that the Sea of Galilee or the Lake of Gennesaret wasn't really all that big, but not because you could generally see from shore to shore in the daylight, and also storms at night, when this particular event takes place, could be more dangerous because you weren't exactly sure that you could see just where the other side was. So the story is well set. Darkness, wind, terrible storm, all kind of coalescing at the same time. Now, one of the things that's interesting here, it's not sometimes overlooked, is that there were other boats that also were coming with the disciples as they were making this journey across the lake. We really don't hear anything more about them. Who was in this other boat? What's the point of it? Now, some say that one of the reasons for that is maybe you and I were in that other boat, kind of able to observe what was going on. Otherwise, how would we know what had happened? Anyway, that is one of the kind of interesting little lines in the Matthean tradition here of who are the members of the other boat. Sea voyages, of course, are always a part of the great stories of people, and there are a couple of sea stories that are included in the Gospels. This would be the first. And where are we going? We're going from the Hebrew or Israeli side to the Gentile side. So as this gospel picks up, we'll find out what they meet on the other side. So this is the first voyage, east to west, okay? If you like geography, they're going east, and when they return, they go west. What is important, of course, and it seems to be why Mark includes this story, is that Jesus takes on the cosmic powers of, and water generally is seen to be very dangerous. The chaotic waters perhaps takes us back to the beginning. In the beginning, the Spirit of God in the book of Genesis says, hovered over the chaotic waters. And over these chaotic waters, God begins to separate light and dark, earth and the waters. And God sets the boundaries of the seas and the oceans. Well, What does that little line from Job? And I said, this is the whole reason why it's chosen, is it makes mention to the fact that God says to Job, you know, when I created the world, when I took the waters and set the limits that they could go this far and no further, you remember when I did that? You see, Job can only, no, of course I don't remember that. Of course I don't know that. And that's the reason, 2 lines, 2 verses of the whole larger speech of God to Job. As I pointed out, referring to this now, beginning in chapter 38 and going to the end of chapter 42, God overwhelms Job by saying, when I did this, when I made the animals, when I put the kind of ocean monsters into the sea, were you there? When I created, you remember all of that, Job? You know, when you were there and you kind of gave me advice to what to do. And Job can only be in fact, twice, Job will respond by saying, I knew these things, but I never really knew them. And he falls down and he thanks and he can say, all I can do is in awe stand before you. So the question of why do innocent people suffer is really never answered in this book. The idea of the justice of God is never really dealt with. It's what makes this a very interesting story. That is the book of Job, but leaves a lot of questions unanswered. But what it does say is that suffering is not necessarily or even generally something that is a punishment. Maybe it's a reality of life. Suffering cannot be avoided as much as we would like to. But it isn't, and this is the point that the book of Job would say, is not God's way of getting back at someone for doing wrong. So the innocent, and that may still shake our heads and say, we would have liked a better answer that the book of Job gives than this. Well, it doesn't. And apparently, even those who heard this story were happy that the ending part, remember I said at the very beginning when we looked at Job that it was like a bookend? Well, when you go to the last chapter of Job, it ends the way that you would like, or we would like. The 3 friends of Job get hollered at by God for not giving the right kind of support that he needed. And then God says to Job, well, because you've been so faithful, everything will be restored to you the way they were, the way it was, rather. And not just once, but double. So the flocks of Job are all doubled. The children of Job are all doubled. Everything turns out, and Job lives to be a ripe old age, and isn't that the way we like good stories to end? So that's the way in which the book of Job ends. But the inner part, the larger part, the struggle of answering questions that are very basically human is not. It's still, all we can kind of wind up with is wonderment of God's graciousness and of God's power. And that, now returning to the gospel, is what Mark seems to have in mind by saying, you see, and there's that little line that concludes the section that we're hearing, that in wonderment, that who is this man who can do the very same things that God did in bringing about the wonderful creation of the universe. And it's Mark's way of introducing to the audience and to his disciples that Jesus is truly the Son of God, and that this enables him to do the very things which God could do. And so that would seem to be the purpose and point of this first voyage story that Mark includes. So when we think of it, in the chaos of life, in the difficulties of life, the healing, calming gifts of Jesus are there also for us, who, I don't know whether you think about it, may be those in that other boat, however it was following this episode. Thank you very much for being with us. Hope to see you.